Вітаю, це брифінг про
Good afternoon. This is a briefing dedicated to the propaganda of the aggressor state, and we will talk about the action that they expect to use to convince both their own citizens and the whole world that the annexation of Ukrainian lands is already inevitable, and they, the Russians, are there to stay. We are talking about the fake elections that took place both in Russia and on the lands they occupied. And in order to emphasize that Russia is going to continue to rule there, they focused all the attention of the propaganda machine on these pseudo-elections in the occupied territories. They even threw heavy artillery into the battle in the form of the former Russian president and now the head of the United Russia Party, Dmitry Medvedev, who began to talk about the fact that there is no legitimate Russian government in these occupied territories as they see it. Dmitry Medvedev held a conference call with the party's branches in the regions where the elections took place. Residents of the new regions, these are the occupied Ukrainian lands, have received normal legal authorities. The turnout in the Donetsk People's Republic was 80%, for United Russia 78%. This is ridiculous. Even the Party of Regions, when it was in power, never got such a result when these lands were not yet occupied by the enemy. Of course, these elections are not recognized by anyone and serve a purely propagandist purpose. But it is also important to understand that there were no observers from all over the world who would come to these elections to light up their essence. What Russia believes to be true, in fact, is a total falsification. That is why even propaganda resources do not mention observers. They talk about some electoral experts who met with the occupation authorities. We discussed the course of the election campaign and the voting process. The main technology is the exit voting, which in these days ensures the safety of all election participants. Let me remind you that exit voting is a direct path to fraud, because there are no observers at this exit voting, and this allows you to completely distort the expression of will. But in this case, we are not even talking about the expression of will, but about a big fake created for propaganda purposes. We also see in these elections even the results according to which four parties, including the United Russia, are elected to the self-proclaimed occupation authorities of Zaporizhia: the Communist Party, the Liberal Democrat Party of Zhirinovsky, and the For Truth Party. In other words, they are fully imitating the electoral picture that Russia itself has in the occupied lands. Of course, these elections are a series of crimes committed by Russia in the occupied territories, and they will also be held accountable. This time for crimes against democracy and for legitimizing the occupation of these lands. At the same time, Russian propaganda is contradicted by the chairman of the State Duma, Volodin, who says that seemingly in these elections there was a high turnout, which showed the desire of the residents of the so-called LPR and DPR, Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, to impact the future development of their region, of our united motherland. Despite the fact that the occupation authorities themselves say that the turnout was low and they achieved the main result due to the exit voting, meanwhile Russia itself is looking for arguments to justify the killing of civilians during the missile attack on Kostyantynivka. As they have always done, they are shifting the responsibility to Ukraine for the crimes they commit themselves. This has happened many times before, in the case of the missile attack on Kramatorsk and Chasiv Yar, and even with the Malaysian Boeing MH17. So, military propagandist Quotes claims Kostyantynivka was struck by Ukraine. This thesis is then expanded upon the numerous Russian propagandists in related publics on the Russia Today channel. The so-called professor of the Institute of Media High School of Economics, Dmitry Yevstafiev, says the visit of U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken to Kiev could be called boring if it had not been accompanied by a bloody provocation in Kostyantynivka, which was carried out with the sole purpose of improving the information background. This is what he says. That is, the Ukrainians themselves allegedly attacked the Ukrainians in Kostyantynivka in order to look more favorable in the negotiations with Blinken. Let me remind you that the Russian authorities kill their opponents in the sky and try to blame others for the crimes they commit. But the Russian propaganda is now as well frustrated after the act of the pilot of the Mi-8 helicopter who flew it to Ukraine and agreed to cooperate with the Ukrainian authorities for a monetary reward. The Russia Today posts lengthy text saying that this pilot betrayed not only his homeland, but also his family. There were traitors in the great patriotic chaotic war too. Maxim Kuzminov will become a noun, and his relatives will live under the shadow of his name all their lives. Although his relatives say they are ashamed of him, his grandfather, who was also a pilot, and prepare his grandson for the sky, would be the most ashamed among all of them, as he was the first person whom Maxim Kuzminov betrayed. Well, probably telling such vivid stories, Russian propaganda should remember that the grandfather of this pilot did not bomb Ukrainian land, and if he had learned that the state that borders Ukraine and guaranteed Ukraine's security is now waging an aggressive war against Ukraine, he might have supported his grandson's action. Meanwhile, former Russian President Medvedev, who now holds the second position in the Russian state hierarchy, continues to show his true form. It's hard to believe that this man once participated in the G8 summits on equal terms with the presidents of America, France, the German Chancellor, etc. Now it's just not even tabloid, it's some kind of backyard rhetoric from an outright bully. So this time Medvedev's attack was against the Brussels diplomats who imposed sanctions on the Russians, and I quote Medvedev's word to word: "The vain idiots in Brussels will collectively and thickly shit their pants." This is coming from a man, I repeat, who holds the second most influential position in the Russian government. What does this mean? That first of all, there are no arguments, so he has to switch to frankly vulgar language, and secondly, that the adequacy of the Russian political leadership is highly questionable, as well as in the adequacy of Russian propaganda, which is trying to somehow support the morale of those who went to war against Ukraine. Military propagandist Golovanov on the Russia Today channel talks about a certain icon of the Mother of God, softener of evil hearts, which allegedly went to the occupation military units, and then he says that it turns out that Ukraine has planned a whole special operation against Russia propagandists in robes. Just for you to understand, a group has arrived at the enemy positions to work on killing our frontline priests. They feel the power coming from their words, and it scares them more than guns and tanks. I have said before that the church plays a key role in Russian propaganda, and of course this process should be adequately assessed during the existence of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, and something from the category of cringe, I would not call it otherwise. Russian propaganda reports about a Chinese vocalist who sang Katyusha on the ruins of the Mariupol theater. At the same time, of course, Russian propaganda claims that the armed forces of Ukraine destroyed the Mariupol theater, just as they accused of us hitting Kostyantynivka, Kramatorsk, and so on. Today, a delegation of journalists and bloggers from China arrived in the Donetsk People's Republic, the name of the occupied territories. One of the members of the group, Chinese opera singer Wang Fan, performed a famous Soviet song on the ruins of the theater. What can this say but about the complete loss of adequacy of Russian propaganda? Another crisis of the genre is that the headquarters of the Foreign Intelligence Service in Russia unveiled a monument to Felix Dzerzhinsky, the number of one Chekist, on his birthday. The monument is a smaller copy of the monument that stood in the center of Moscow, opposite the KGB building complex on Lubyanka Square. And basically, this is where we can say that the spiral of history in Russia has closed from the demolition of Dzerzhinsky's monument after the collapse of the Soviet Union and democratic transformation to the restoration of dictatorship and the return to Dzerzhinsky to the headquarters of the Foreign Intelligence Service. I will conclude this briefing with a traditional appeal. Of course, Russian propaganda is poisonous, and please ignore it. If you live outside of Ukraine and want to see the news in English, you can watch the UATV channel. In Russian, the Freedom Channel. Trust only the Ukrainian official media, the Ukrainian military and political leadership. See you.
До зустрічі!